Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Today we're going to be talking about the turning point of the American Revolution, which of course is the Battle of Kings Mountain in October of 1780. But to really understand the Battle of Kings Mountain, and indeed to understand the American Revolution in general, we have to return to the French and Indian War, which began 22 years before America declared independence from Great Britain. Of course, the term French and Indian War today is a little bit out of fashion among historians, as it implies perhaps the French were fighting the Indians, or that the French and the Indians were the bad guys in the war, for which there are a couple of complaints. First, while the English were fighting against the French and the Indians, there are also Indians on the side of the British. The Cherokee, for a time at least, supported the British. The Iroquois League, for the most part, supported the British. So to present the French and the Indians as the enemies leaves out the fact that there were Indians on the British side as well. Second, there are many historians today who feel that we should take a more unbiased view and to present the war as the French and Indian War with them as the enemies is implicitly taking the side of the British. My viewpoint, however, is that I had family at the Draper's Meadow Massacre in 1755, and to me the Shawnee at least are the enemy. And so I will stick with calling it the French and Indian War, but you will often hear it called the 7 Years' War, which is the appropriate term for it in Europe, to where the war spread 2 years after it began in the United States. So in Europe there truly was a 7 Years' War from 1756 to 1763. It's also sometimes called the Great War for Empire, as it did revolve around consolidating empires, either the British or the French Empire in North America, and indeed around the world. Some people have described the French and Indian War as the First World War, as there was fighting on every known continent, every known inhabited continent, Antarctica not yet being discovered, and Australia not being inhabited by Europeans, and so it does not count. For example, just as the British were fighting the French and the Indians in North America, in South Asia, the British were also fighting the French and the Indians, just a different sort of Indians. Of course, as you probably know, because we're speaking English today, the English won the war. And the French went home, but the Indians couldn't because they already were at home. And so, while the war may have officially ended with the Peace of Paris in 1763, there were some American Indians who naturally resisted the British settlers who tried to move into their territory, in particular those led by Chief Pontiac around the Great Lakes. And the British responded to Pontiac's rebellion and other potential threats of Indian uprising with a royal proclamation, the Proclamation of 1763, banning settlement or even trade west of the Appalachian Mountains, of a point known as the Proclamation Line. And like many British policies in the decade or so following the French and Indian War, this made sense in many ways. The British did hope to avoid conflict with the Indians, and in general wanted to exert more control over 13 colonies that had largely been allowed to govern themselves ever since their foundation. But this would also be the first of many policies that might seem good on paper, but which were communicated to the colonies very poorly and implemented very ineffectively. Had the British stuck by some of their earliest plans, they might have kept the colonies within the British Empire. But the British would pass an unpopular law. There would be resistance to it, and in most cases the British would back down, but make a point of not backing down completely, so that the colonists learned that resistance worked. Whereas the British would then provoke the colonists once more, but would then face further resistance, which would seem to work, until the British went ahead and did something else, which in turn would be resisted. And again, the Proclamation of 1763 was one of these poorly received British policies. For many of the colonists, the war had been about gaining land west of the Appalachians, particularly in the fertile Ohio River Valley, which might be good for farming and would definitely be good for fur trading, and which was claimed by the colony of Virginia, and portions were also claimed by by New York and Connecticut and others. In fact, even before the war came to an end, Daniel Boone visited what is now East Tennessee in 1760, hiding from the Indians beneath a waterfall in what's known as Boone's Creek in East Tennessee, supposedly killing a bear, climbing a tree and carving his name in that event in the side of the tree. And so he was in some ways scouting the area for future settlement. Principally he was hunting, but he and other hunters began laying claim to the land as well. The first permanent white settlers to settle in what is now East Tennessee being William Bean and his wife Lydia, who settled just north of what's now Johnson City in 1769, and soon had a son, Russell Bean, the first white child born, as far as we know, in what is now Tennessee. But because these and many settlers who followed them were living beyond the Proclamation line, they were outside any official British government. They were probably within the boundaries of the colony of North Carolina, which was a colony itself having quite a bit of conflict between its backcountry people and the unpopular royal governor Tryon. Although it was possible that some of what is now East Tennessee was part of Virginia, the Treaty of Lochaber, having permitted some British settlement in what's now southwestern Virginia, which probably included a bit of what is now upper East Tennessee, Bristol and parts of Kingsport, for example. But being largely outside royal jurisdiction, those settlers who were here and who wanted to have laws to govern themselves, and especially legal authority to survey and claim land, create a government of their own, which they called the Watauga Association, after the Watauga River. And while they never explicitly described themselves as an independent government, they were later described by, among others, Theodore Roosevelt as the first independent government created by British settlers in North America. The Royal Governor of Virginia, Lord Dunmore, a couple years after the creation of the Watauga Association, described it as a dangerous example of a people setting up a government independent of the king's authority. But nothing was really done about this Watauga settlement until the American Revolution had broken out. Because, since most of these settlements were beyond the Proclamation of 1763, with again some of those in what's now Sullivan County, Tennessee, possibly being open to legal settlement, because the Proclamation had envisioned gradually settling the land, but through a series of careful treaties. The majority of the settlers, though, were clearly west of the Proclamation line, and so when fighting broke out in New England in 1775 and spread to the rest of the colonies in 1775 and 76, the British government decided to drive these western settlers off their land, working with the Cherokee, who had a claim to the land, to attack some of these settlements in what's now East Tennessee in 1776. Attacks which were largely held off by the local militia and forts built by the local settlers, including what was then called Fort Caswell, but is often remembered today as Fort Watauga, which held a long siege by the Cherokee. After this, though, the people living west of the Appalachians were largely left out of the American Revolution, managing their own affairs, aside from declaring what's now East Tennessee to be the Washington District of North Carolina, which did now officially accept them, now that it was no longer concerned about royal proclamations. Indeed, the war, for the most part, stayed in the North, in New England, in New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, for the first few years of the war, aside from the great American victory in Charleston in 1776, where a fort of green palmetto logs was able to deflect the British cannonballs, winning a big victory for America and establishing the palmetto tree as a symbol of South Carolina. But by about 1778, the British and American forces in the North had reached a stalemate. The British occupied New York City, having been driven out of Boston, having captured but soon abandoned Philadelphia, George Washington's army mostly sat outside New York City, keeping the British trapped within. And so, to try to create a second front, the British began to move into the South, where it was felt there were a large number of loyalists who would support the British if there were just some professional British soldiers to back them up. And the British captured Savannah. They captured Charleston, returning to that city where they had once suffered a huge defeat, and went on to inflict upon America our worst defeat of the war. 5,000 Americans surrendered at Charleston, the biggest surrender in the history of the U.S. Army, until a surrender at Bataan in 1942. And just as the Japanese treated American prisoners captured at Bataan horribly, the British treated American prisoners captured at Charleston horribly, locking many of them in rotting ships used as prisons in Charleston Harbor, where many died of disease, as did Andrew Jackson's mother, who had gone to serve as a nurse for British soldiers there, American prisoners of the British there. And from there, the British moved further north into central South Carolina, up into North Carolina, and Patriot forces fled before them, although some certainly did conduct guerrilla warfare. The Swamp Fox, the Carolina Gamecock, and others being famous for their resistance to the British. And this did draw in some of the people living west of the mountains, sometimes referred to as the over-mountain men, because they lived over the mountains. Some of whom did come over the mountains to fight the British on their western flank, particularly British soldiers commanded by Major Patrick Ferguson. I say British soldiers, but in fact, aside from Ferguson himself, all the men under his command were American-born loyalists, although of course they viewed themselves as British. Most were loyalists from North and South Carolina, fighting in their own militia units. He had some men, primarily from New York, who had come south with him, who actually wore red coats, having become a provincial unit within the British Army. And as they felt pressure from the people living in the mountains of western North Carolina, which includes what's now East Tennessee, Ferguson, whose duty was to protect the western flank of the British Army, sent a warning to the people living in what is now East Tennessee, southwestern Virginia, that they needed to lay down their arms and cease their opposition to the British, or else Ferguson would march over the mountains, hang their leaders, and lay waste to the country with fire and sword. This did not lead to the end of resistance, however. Instead, this so infuriated the people living in upper East Tennessee and southwestern Virginia that they resolved to go and fight Ferguson. And so in September, around 1,000 men mustered in what is now Elizabethton, Tennessee. Many from East Tennessee, a large number coming from around Abingdon and southwestern Virginia, and from there marched over the mountains into North Carolina, gathering more men as they went. Known again as the Over Mountain Men, perhaps because they marched over the mountains to fight the British. And it's worth noting that while in many conflicts men have had to be drafted to go off and fight, when the time came to resist Ferguson and the British, there was so great a desire to fight him. The people living here did not have to be drafted to go and fight, but 1 out of 7 volunteers had to be drafted to remain at home and defend their settlements in case of a possible attack by the Indians. The Over Mountain Men marched, or in many cases rode, over the mountains, even driving cattle along with them to serve as provisions on the way. And by early October, they had gotten close to the border between North and South Carolina, where Ferguson, aware they were coming, had set up a camp on top of a low hill known as King's Mountain. And having gathered loyalist militia from North and South Carolina around him, having sent out a number of public letters to the people there, warning them that the backcountry men, the dregs of mankind, he called them, were coming over the mountains. he told the local loyalist militia they needed to rise up and defend their homes unless they wished to be pissed upon forever by a pack of mongrels, and have their women turn their backs upon them and look for real men to protect them. Ferguson declared from his camp atop Kings Mountain that God himself could not get him off the mountain. The Over Mountain men, though, were coming anyway, marching through the rain, eventually having a large group on horseback ride through the rain towards Kings Mountain to try to surprise Ferguson. Some of them, in turn, stayed some distance from the mountain to guard the horses and keep them from making noise that might give them away. And from there, the Over Mountain men headed towards Kings Mountain itself, under the command of a council of 5 colonels, representing the county regiments of several North Carolina militia, including some from what's now East Tennessee, and about 400 men from southwestern Virginia, under the command of Colonel William Campbell, who was declared to be the overall commander, although many people, including the British, viewed the real commander as being Colonel Isaac Shelby, from what is now Sullivan County, East Tennessee, later the first governor of Kentucky, because he had fought the British already in some earlier battles in the mountains. Another prominent leader was Colonel John Sevier, from what is now Washington County, Tennessee, who would go on to be Tennessee's first governor. I've always assumed they chose William Campbell to be the leader, to the extent there was one, because of all the regiments involved. His was the largest. He brought about 400 men. Although I heard proposed a few years back that the real reason may have been that, as the only colonel not from North Carolina, by picking the Virginian, it was able to let the North Carolina colonels kind of avoid a conflict over precedence in which North Carolinian would lead the others. They could instead defer to the Virginian, even though he was the youngest of them, of all. And really, once battle began, each unit largely managed itself, the colonels having decided in a council of war that they would surround the mountain and charge up it to try to defeat the British. The battle lasted barely over an hour, 65 minutes in total, as the Over Mountain men would try to go up the mountain, taking cover behind trees as they went and shooting at the British forces. All again, it's worth pointing out, all but their actual leader, Major Ferguson, were Americans themselves, giving the Battle of Kings Mountain and much of the Revolution in the South very much the flavor of a civil war. Ferguson's men in turn would fix their bayonets, charge down the slopes, and push the Over Mountain men back. But the Over Mountain men would simply go back up the hill, pushing Ferguson's men back again, until eventually Ferguson's men began to grow desperate. As Ferguson blew a silver whistle to emphasize his orders, his men fought, but eventually some began raising white flags of surrender. Ferguson rode among them with his sword, chopping down the flags of surrender that were raised, until Ferguson himself grew desperate and tried to lead a small group of men to break through American lines, at which point he was shot 7 times by Over Mountain men before he fell off his horse. The rest of the British were soon defeated, several hundred being killed, either during the battle or in quite a few cases killed as they tried to surrender, as the British under Colonel Tarleton had done to Americans trying to surrender at the Waxhaws not long before. A few were executed afterwards, following a short trial, and many hundreds of them surrendered. Around 900 Over Mountain men, surrounding and killing or capturing around 1,000 British soldiers, Americans, fighting for the crown. And Major Ferguson himself was killed there on top of Kings Mountain, but his insistence that God himself could not get him off the mountain turned out to be true, as the Over Mountain men buried him on top of the mountain and then urinated upon his corpse. They buried him along with one of his mistresses, who was shot with a stray bullet during the battle. And Ferguson's body is still on Kings Mountain. Should you ever visit the National Battlefield there, you can visit his grave, although the rangers there discourage you from urinating on it today. And after this, most of the Over-Mountain men went home, although some continued to fight in various ways, and there would be several other important battles later in 1780, and especially in 1781. But after the Battle of Kings Mountain and the Battle of Cowpens not long afterwards, Loyalist forces were so badly defeated that Loyalists were not willing, for the most part, to openly support the crown to the degree they had been. And with the forces guarding his western flanks so thoroughly defeated, the British commander in the south, General Lord Cornwallis, was forced to turn back east, moving to the Carolinas, having to abandon or destroy many of his supplies to try to keep up with General Nathanael Greene, who was deliberately leading him on a wild goose chase to exhaust him, before he finally made it to Yorktown, Virginia, where he would be defeated about a year after the Battle of Kings Mountain. And so that brings us back to our original question, of whether Kings Mountain is the turning point of the war. And to be sure, most historians will really pinpoint the turning point of the American Revolution in the Saratoga campaign of 1777, when Gentleman Johnny Burgoyne, an entire British army, were forced to surrender in New York, officially surrendering to General Horatio Gates of the U.S. Army. But Gates's victory was largely due to the heroism of another general, Benedict Arnold, who felt, as he had felt before, he never got the recognition he deserved from the American people or American Congress, and eventually he would seek revenge for that snub in his own way. Certainly the Battle of Saratoga, or the Saratoga campaign, we should say, is incredibly important. It was such a large victory that after that, the French decided it was worth openly allying with the United States, which would play a huge role in America's victory. That said, the Battle of Kings Mountain was a very important battle in the war in the South. Indeed, so important that Thomas Jefferson, who was paying attention to the war effort, I'm sure, described it as the turning point on the road to success. Theodore Roosevelt, in his history series, The Winning of the West, described it as the turning point of the Revolution. And the overall British commander in North America, General Sir Henry Clinton, described it as the first link in a chain of evils, which led to the end of the war. So, is unquestionably an important moment in the Revolution in the South, a very important moment in the history of East Tennessee and Western North Carolina, indeed all of Tennessee and Kentucky, and the western and southern part of the Revolutionary War. And a moment when independent Americans showed that they were prepared to fight against enormous odds to defend their homes and their freedom.